y'all, it's Ashley Bookishrealm and I'm back with another video. So today I am here to do my February wrap up. I'm actually doing it on time, which is a huge surprise. I cannot believe that. I did end up doing a mid-month wrap up, which I will make sure that I link my mid-month wrap up in the card symbol above. I'm glad that I did a mid-month wrap up because I ended up reading a total of 50 books this month, and there was no way that I was going to be able to wrap up all 50 books in one sitting. That was just actually just not going to be humanly possible. So if you're interested in hearing any of the details that I have about those first group of books, then I will make sure, like I said, that it should be linked in the card symbol above. Go ahead and check that out. All right, so we're going to jump in and we're just going to start with the stats, which is different because I actually stopped doing stats for a very, very long time, which is super unfortunate because I actually like doing stats, which is, you know, I think I like the idea of the stats. Let me stop lying and saying I like doing stats. I like the idea of having the stats available for those who like to see them. The compiling part is not so much fun, but it is cool to kind of see exactly where I am in my reading in terms of like different genres, pages read, etc. I am keeping stats a little bit better this year because I do want to reach that 100,000 page count goal that I set for myself in the beginning of the year, and keeping stats will definitely help me do that because sometimes Goodreads does or does not include page numbers depending upon what edition, and sometimes I don't pay attention to the edition, so it helps that I'm keeping my own statistics. So let's go ahead and jump into the statistics. So like I said before, I did end up reading 50 books this month, January. In the month of January, I read 50 books, which is a little bit higher than normal for me. I usually am somewhere between like the 20 and 30 range, but I was not coping with life in the month of January. So I ended up reading 50 books. And so my page count ended up being 12,762 pages this month, which is the largest amount of pages that I've ever read in a single month since I've been keeping track of anything or since I've been on Goodreads, which is really, really good. I'm very, very proud of myself, not for the number of books, but like that I actually was selecting books that were larger in page count. So yeah, 12,762 pages, which led to an average of 418 pages a day. Understanding in the pages read, I am counting my audiobooks, but I also like to include this audiobook stat so you know exactly how many hours of audiobooks I've been listening to. For the month of January, listened to 221 hours and 30 minutes worth of audio. It's a lot of audiobooks. I think there's somewhere around like 9 days straight. If I was listening to audio nonstop, it would be 9 days straight worth of audio. So that's very, very interesting stat to kind of keep in mind. Yes. In terms of my genre breakdown, I read 2 books that were historical fiction, 20 which I put into the category of graphic novel, comics, and manga. In romance, I broke it down into several subcategories, so 11 of them were contemporary, 1 was a historical romance, and 1 was a fantasy romance. I read 2 books that were mystery/thrillers, 2 books that I consider to be realistic fiction. This can be, you know, like contemporary fiction, not like contemporary romance, but more like contemporary fiction, literary fiction, and realistic fiction. I just put all of that into that one category. 2 that were sci-fi. I know it says I didn't read any picture books in January, but that's a lie. I read a lot of picture books in January. I just am not good about tracking my picture book reading, so technically because I didn't track anything, I did put 0 for that category. I read 5 nonfiction books and 2 fantasy books, so it was nice seeing my numbers in sci-fi and fantasy go up. I usually do not read a lot of sci-fi fantasy at all, so it was actually quite rewarding to know that I did have those numbers increase. In terms of the target age audience, I read 2 books that were targeted at children, 31 that were targeted at adults, 9 that were targeted at a YA audience, and 8 that were targeted at a middle grade audience. So this is still not as 50-50 as I want it to be, but I think that the numbers are decent. So still primarily reading adult because I am an adult now and I do gravitate towards a lot more adult stuff, but I am double dabbling in a lot, of course, of YA children to middle grade because of the work that I do. In terms of format, 9 of the books that I read were physical books, 20 were ebooks, and 21 were audiobooks. So we did end up going more so 50-50 on the physical and ebook compared to my audiobook listening, which is great. In terms of my sources, 13 of the books that I read were borrowed from the library, so that could have been from Libby or Hoopla. 9 of them are books that I ended up owning, and when I say owning, that doesn't necessarily mean it was just a physical copy. It could be a digital book I own, an audiobook that I own, or a physical copy that I own. 8 of the books that I read were review copies. 4 of them I got from Kindle Unlimited. 3 of them I got from Audible, and 3 I listened to through Libro FM. I am a librarian affiliate with Libro FM, so I get monthly advanced listening copies from them, and 3 of the books that I listened to in January were from that site, which is a good independent site if you want to support independent bookstores and give back through the purchase of audiobooks. Some additional stuff that I keep track of, that I've been keeping track of for quite a while, is I look for LGBTQIA plus rep. 5 of my books had this representation. 7 of my books were translated this month, which is great. I know I'm trying to increase the number of books that I'm reading that are translated. Still heavy on the side of graphic translations, more so than prose translations, but we are working on it. 6 of the books that I read were rereads. 2 of the books that I read were over 500 pages, which is great. I don't want to shy away from reading those tomes. I want to make sure that I'm actively reading those tomes and not run from them, so I'm glad to see that 2 of them were over 500 pages this month. 15 of the books that I read were specifically by Black authors. This is something that I had been keeping track of for a few years now, so I decided to keep it in. And 2 of the books that I read had some type of disability representation, whether that was in the protagonist or with the author. In terms of my star rating, I gave 2 books 2 stars. I gave 8 books 3 stars. 9 books got 3.5 stars. 23 books got 4 stars, so that means it was a pretty good reading month for 23 of the books that I read to be in the 4-star category. 1 was a 4.5 and 6 were 5-star reads, which it's nice to know that I had 6 5-star reads in a month. That gave me an average of 3.72, I believe. Y'all, I had the math right and I looked down at my sheet and it was wrong. Whatever the correct thing is, it will be on the screen, but I somehow deleted it. I did the math and I deleted it. It's okay. Nothing to stress over. So in terms of authors, 28 of the books that I read by authors were by BIPOC authors and 22 were by white authors. 14 of the books that I read were written by men, 36 were written by women, and 1 was written by a non-binary author. And those numbers probably are a little off because of, like, if it was a male-female duo type of thing going on, so those numbers may be kind of a little skewed. 3 of the authors that I read books from identified as queer, and 47 I don't know, or they were not queer, and I didn't want to make any assumptions, and I didn't want to go on a wild goose chase trying to figure out someone's gender identity or sexual orientation unless they came forward and they said it themselves. So I always put not queer or unknown into one category, and I don't try to kind of, dig too deep into that if someone doesn't want that information to be known. So 3 and 47 were my stats. Okay, so now that we got the statistics out of the way, we're going to go ahead and jump right in to the books that I ended up reading in the second half of January. I'm kind of going to do this the same way where I often go in and I do the books first, and then I save the comics, graphic novels, manga, picture books for the end. So we're going to keep up that same tradition. There's a particular book that you want to see reviewed. I'm sure I will try my hardest to make sure I have the time stamps down below in the description box. The first book that I ended up reading was Daughter of the Moon Goddess, and this is by Su Lin Tan, and I was super excited to pick this up. I know that a lot of people have been talking about it, and I was of course a little hesitant because it is a fantasy book, and we all know that I struggle a lot with reading fantasy and sci-fi, but this one ended up being a really great read. It was one of my favorites of January. It's a book that focuses on a main character that of course is a daughter of the moon goddess. It's based on Chinese mythology, which I was not familiar with the actual story, like the legend behind this entire novel, but our main character is technically not supposed to exist, and when there's a possibility that someone may discover who she is and that she has some abilities, her mom decides that it's in her best interest if she goes away. Eventually, because of this, she makes her way to the celestial kingdom, and she ends up meeting the prince there, and she becomes friends with the prince, and a little, bit of love interest there going on, and also in their friendship, she's kind of like his aide of sorts. So it's really interesting because I'm never really sure where to start with my praises of this novel. It is, like I said, kind of hard to believe that this is a debut novel. It's written very, very well. It's super accessible, and I think what makes this book really interesting is that the author has described this as kind of like an in-between in terms of like target age audience. It is an in-between YA and adult, and I think that it is really accessible for those who are trying to transition from YA to to reading adult. I know that's a big conversation in the community. Not here to talk about that, but it is sort of an in-between novel of sorts, and it has a lot of political intrigue in it, which is one element that I'm very surprised to say that I really enjoy in fantasy novels, because in political intrigue, like, you know that no one can be trusted, and it's very high stakes. It feels very high, like, energy, and I think it keeps me on the edge of my seat. And this is one that includes a lot of political intrigue, and I love that the author not only uses it to shape the plot, but it is the catalyst for one of the craziest plot twists that I think I have ever seen in a fantasy book that I have read, and I really enjoyed that. There's a lot of elemental magic in this one. There is magic in the forms of, like, these creatures that we get to see, whether that's mer people, dragons, and more. It's just a lot. The world seems to be extremely expansive, which is great, because I think that readers are going to be able to see a lot of that in the second installment of this series. I think it's just going to be a duology. I think too, with Tan being, like, just an excellent writer, just in general, an accessible writer when it comes to fantasy, I will also say that she is great at character development. Our main character, our heroine, is very easy to root for. I love the relationship that she has with her mother. We don't really get to see a lot of it until, like, towards the end of the book and the beginning, but everything that she does is motivation to see her mother and to help her mother, and I just love that mother-daughter bond that we get to see. There is a love triangle that takes place, but it is a love triangle that is done right. It's not the typical love triangle that you see in, like, YA fantasy. And there is a lovers to enemies trope, which I've never seen before. Enemies to lovers all the time, but lovers to enemies, and the fallout of the love triangle is epic, and it was done perfectly, and it didn't feel as though it was just a random thing that happened, or it wasn't logical that the love triangle ends up breaking in some way. It just worked really well, and I really enjoyed it. If you can't tell, I absolutely love this book, and I ended up giving it 5 stars, and I cannot wait for the second book in the duology to come out. The next book that I want to talk about is Vital Moon. This is the latest release by Mahogany L. Brown. This is the 3rd book that I've read by this author, and she never seems to disappoint me whatsoever. I really love everything that she has done. This particular book focuses on a character by the name of Angel, and she ends up becoming a transplant to Brooklyn after she gets out of an abusive relationship. And when she's there, she is in this program that is run by the school, and I believe, if I'm remembering this right, the program is called Her. And while connecting with others and connecting with some teachers, she is able to discover her love of Black literature. So there are countless names of very prominent and well-known Black authors, writers that are included in this text. I mean, everybody from Toni Morrison to Jason Reynolds to Maya Angelou, and you see Angel fall in love with reading, and reading becomes her healing, which I really resonated with, because I, like I said, was not really coping very well with some stuff this past month, and reading is often where I find my solace to kind of heal and really work through some things. And so that part of the book was just really great. And as she spends more time in Brooklyn, you see so much more about its culture, its history, the music, the food, and everything is being seen through Angel's eyes. So it's like discovering it for the first time, which I really did appreciate. I think one thing that is particularly interesting about this book is that it does address the trauma that Angel goes through, and I've seen a lot of criticisms of the fact that this book does not explicitly reveal all of the trauma that Angel goes through, and I think that that's okay. This is an example of a book in which you can acknowledge the trauma maybe of a specific group, but you don't have to lay it bare for the world to see and have to take your readers through that hard-hitting experience. I know I typically read books like that, but I could appreciate what the author was attempting to do with this, and to really acknowledge just some things about the Black community, but not make it exploitive. So it didn't feel like she was taking advantage of someone else's trauma. I don't know if that really makes sense, but it just worked within the context of this book. And what's unique about this book too is it's a mix of poetry and prose, so you get little tidbits of so many different things. And the whole entire thing, it's a short book. A lot of Mahogany books are extremely short, but they do end up packing a punch. I really enjoyed this one, and I ended up giving it 4 out of 5 stars. The next book that I ended up reading was a middle grade nonfiction book, and it is Star Child, a biological constellation of Octave by Octavia Estelle Butler. So of course this is a short biography of Octavia E. Butler, and I got this one as a review copy, and I was like, I definitely want to check this one out. I have not read anything by Octavia E. Butler, but I have read quite a few things by E.B. Savoy, and I was interested to see what she was going to do with this. It was a fascinating book, especially coming from someone who doesn't really know much about Octavia E. Butler and has not picked up her works. I don't know if people who are like super fans, if they're going to gain anything from this, but I think younger readers who are learning more about science fiction and fantasy, and specifically about Octavia E. Butler, they would enjoy a lot of this information. And me being newer and not having read anything by her, it definitely was enjoyable for me. So the format of it itself was particularly interesting, where we get a poem that was written by E.B. Savoy, and it directly relates to Octavia E. Butler's life, and then she would connect those dots for the reader by explaining exactly what aspect of Octavia E. Butler's life she was discussing. I was happy to see so many different things that inspired her writing, like historical events that were happening that inspired Butler's writing, including like the space race, the Red Scare, the plight of Black people in America. It literally just made me super excited to pick up her books, because she just seemed like such an intriguing person. And I know that this book was very important for E.B. Savoy to write, because she did end up meeting Butler at some point in her life. They share the same birthday, and it was definitely just her passion for writing. And I think that she was able to capture the perseverance of Butler, because I did not realize that she had so many struggles, like growing up, in terms of like being shy and people associating her shyness or her quietness with not being intelligent, and the things that her parents had gone through. It was so much stuff and so many things that she kind of persevered through, and I think that E.B. Savoy was definitely able to capture that. The cover is beautiful. This is just a great introductory nonfiction text that I recommend for all ages. If you have a little one that maybe can't read this full thing just yet, I would separate it and read it to them. It was great, and I ended up giving it 4 out of 5 stars. The next book that I ended up reading was also another children's nonfiction, and that was Evicted: The Struggle for the Right to Vote, and this was written by Alice Faye Duncan and illustrated by Charlie Parma. The book itself focuses on a group of individuals that lived in Fayette County, Tennessee, and they decided to advocate for the right of the Black community to be able to vote after they were unable to sit on the jury of a Black man that was convicted of or accused of murder. I think he was eventually convicted, and they felt like at that time that they needed to make a change. So they rallied community members together. People were trying to register to vote. They were trying to just vote in general, and as a result, there was a lot of, I think, tenant farmers out there. And as soon as the property owners found out that they had all of these Black people who were trying to register to vote, they began to evict them from their properties. So these individuals that were evicted would then stay on the land of other people within the county that did own their own property, and it was later known as Tent City, because you'd see all these tents that were just pitched outside of community members attempting to help each other in some way, some form. And it was just a great read. I know that we talk a little bit about the struggle to vote in Black history, but this was a specific instance of that fight to be able to vote that I didn't know much about, and I learned a lot. The illustrations were great. It is a mix of prose and poetry for those who may struggle a little bit with reading nonfiction that is simply in prose, and there's a lot of resources and stuff in the back of the book if people are interested in learning more. I ended up giving this one 4 out of 5 stars. So the next book that I ended up reading was Electric Idol, which is the second book in the Dark Olympus series by Katie Roberts. This is a fantasy romance series, and the first book is Neon Gods, which is a book that I did not like as much as I thought I was going to like it. I think I gave that one only 3 stars when I read it, but I did end up liking this one a lot more. So Electric Idol, I gave 4 stars to, and it focuses on a new set of characters, and that is Psyche and Eros. And I don't necessarily think you have to read them in order, because the stories are in some ways self-contained, but they're not really, because you do get to see Persephone and Hades pop up in this book, and they do help in terms of the plot when it comes to the second book. But I think that if you read them out of order, I don't know how much damage it would really do, but of course they're just not coming out, so it probably is the best time to go ahead and read them in order. So this one, like I said, it focuses on 2 main characters, Psyche and Eros, and they're not enemies, but their parents don't really get along. So Eros's mother is Aphrodite, and of course we know that Psyche's mother is Demeter, and they are not friendly. They don't get along. But it's interesting because something happens, and what we see is Psyche kind of helps to step in and help him out, meaning Eros help him out after an incident at a event, and it actually pisses Aphrodite off, and she orders Eros to kill Psyche, which which is so extreme. But then knowing her personality as a goddess, I'm really not that surprised at all, to be quite honest with you. So yes, I'm not super surprised by that at all. So she ends up ordering Eros to kill her, and he makes a decision in order to save her to not have to kill her, that the two of them would end up getting married. I think the dynamics of this one were a lot better in the sense that I bought into the chemistry between Eros and Psyche. They were super compatible, but it's not to say that Persephone and Hades weren't compatible characters, but I think that there was supposed to be some political intrigue that happened in the first book, especially with Hades and his want of having Persephone for himself. This one is different because I think that there literally is a lot of political intrigue that happens because they have to navigate working how to get Aphrodite from not killing Psyche. Even after they get married, she still is kind of set in her ways to damage her as much as she can. And it was nice having a heroine that was not only just pretty in the face and was this social media person, but really knew the game that needed to be played. She wasn't super dependent upon Eros to do anything really for her. I think they eventually built that bond, but she was able to create scenarios too where they were able to outwit Aphrodite and figure out what needed to be done. It's kind of sad because of the relationship that Eros has with his mother Aphrodite. It just was not great. She clearly is emotionally abusive, and it explains a lot about his character, but the way that he cares for Psyche is absolutely beautiful. It was nice seeing other characters kind of pop in. The steamy scenes, the sex scenes between the two of them were A1 on point, but I always say Katie Robert has a gift for writing steamy scenes. They're always really, really good. But for me, I think the plot in this one was 10 times better because the political intrigue, it really did feel like Aphrodite was a problem. Whereas in the first book, I felt like Hades was talked about as an issue, but he really didn't become an issue until like the final moments of the book. So you felt like there was all this talk about him, but this man really wasn't a threat as much as they wanted to make him out to be. But in this one, you know, Aphrodite really is a threat. Like, she truly is a problem, and it's something that is acknowledged very early on, and it is a continuous pattern that you see throughout the context of the book. I'm really excited to pick up the next one, but I'm glad that I enjoyed this one much more than the first one, because I was like, if I didn't enjoy this, I think I was probably going to end up dropping the series. But I am glad that I did end up enjoying it. So the next book that I ended up reading was The Supervillains Guide to Being a Fat Kid by Matt Wallace. This is definitely not what I was expecting in terms of a middle grade book. It covers some really tough topics like self-esteem, self-isolation, bullying, identity, parental issues, etc. But it all is taking place from the perspective of a middle grade boy, especially when we're talking about body image and being fat on page. You don't find that a lot in middle grade from the perspective of boys. So it was nice to kind of see that in this book. So the book itself focuses on a main character by the name of Max, and Max is a fat kid who is entering 6th grade, and he knows that he is fat. He calls himself fat. He identifies as fat, and he's hoping that by starting 6th grade, he will be able to work a little bit more to fit in and not really be judged just on the size of his body. But unfortunately, it pretty much is like kind of this cyclical thing where he is getting bullied and picked on, and he's not really in a safe space. And part of it is a little unrealistic because there's little to no teacher intervention in this, which did make it kind of weird to be like, okay, where's the teacher? Where's the teacher? Where's the teacher intervention in this? Or teachers like really not believing it. So in order to kind of cope with learning how to fit in and how to navigate being a fat kid in middle school, he ends up writing to the supervillain. And the supervillain and him have a very interesting relationship because the supervillain also identifies as fat, and they recognize together in their correspondence that there is an issue with people judging them for their body and not who they are as individuals. So the supervillain ends up giving him a lot of advice, and as an adult reader, you can tell that there's flaws in the communication. But I think for middle grade readers, they're going to start to recognize the flaws in the communication as Max starts to realize the flaws in the communication. And in essence, the message is not all advice is good advice, even when it's given to you from someone who has a lot in common with you. And that definitely is the narrative of this entire thing. And Max does learn that in the end. And he learns that when you hyper focus on yourself, sometimes you end up doing things to better yourself, but you hurt people along the way. One thing that I wish that this book did a little bit more of is developing the actual world. It is clearly some type of society or city where the idea of superheroes existing and supervillains existing is not really abnormal. It's a part of their everyday society. Superheroes are these celebrities that everybody loves and enjoys, and I like that Max questions the morality of superheroes, because these are the same individuals who destroy cities and don't do anything to clean them up. I've seen that explored a lot in DC and Marvel and some other superhero stuff that I read, so it was nice seeing it in a middle grade setting. But I wish that Wallace would have taken a little bit more time to develop that and explore that more, because it seems like it would be an important aspect of the story, especially because Max is dealing with a supervillain, but I don't feel like he dives into it just enough. So I ended up giving this one 3.5 stars. The next book that I ended up reading is one that a lot of people seem to be enjoying, and that is The Love Con by Ceresia Glass. And this is one that I wanted to enjoy a lot more than I did. I only ended up giving it 3 out of 5 stars. It focuses on a main character by the name of Kenya, and Kenya, at the beginning of the novel, she is in this cosplay competition. She's hoping to change her career into doing like cosplay design and stuff full time, and we enter the story as she is getting judged and entering possibly into the final round. And when they announce the final round, when she's able to move on, it is a couples round or a partner round, and so she declares that her best friend, her long-term best friend, is going to be her partner, or is her partner. They don't know that that's her best friend, but she basically says that that is her partner, her boyfriend, whatever. So clearly we are entering a story that's going to touch a little bit on fake dating. However, I had so many different like little things that bothered me about this book. First, we don't really know anything about the competition prior to what we're seeing in that opening round, in which she is questioning, or she's getting judged to move on to the final round. And it's kind of strange to me because there is a lot of tension that exists between Kenya and some other contestants, and also a particular judge. And instead of that really being shown to us, we're told that information. And I think it would have been nice to see that in context of like the entire competition, instead of us just entering into this round where I feel like we were kind of dropped and dumped into a story that had already been going on before we came in as readers, which I think is really awkward. Another thing, this is supposed to be a friends to lover trope. However, I don't like friends to lover tropes, and I'm realizing this, I'm learning this, where the two have been pining for each other. And it's not realistic that over the course of all this time, it's like these two characters did not know that either one of them had feelings for each other. It just didn't feel realistic. I may have come across a couple that may have been, but in this context, it didn't really work for me, because as soon as we see Cameron for the first time really on page, it's obvious that the two of them have chemistry and they have feelings for each other. So for me, it no longer felt like a friends to lovers trope. It felt like a miscommunication trope, which if you know anything about me in romance, I don't like miscommunicate. I don't like miscommunication at all. And so it just made me like not as invested in the relationship, because once again, we're told about their relationship. We don't really get to see much of like the backstory behind the relationship. So in that case, it just becomes a little bit awkward, because it's clear that they already have feelings for each other. So it's not so much about them developing feelings, it's about them getting over this communication barrier so they can tell each other that they have feelings for each other. So it made me so much less invested in their relationship. And this is a romance, and when I'm not invested in a relationship, the whole context and purpose of the book is kind of just not there anymore. I did enjoy the fact that we did get to see a lot of like nerdy stuff with a black plus size woman as the lead. That was excellent. I think the plus size representation was really, really great. And I love seeing a black woman that was into cosplay and into comics and all things geeky and nerdy. For someone who's into that stuff as a black woman, it was really important for me to see that representation. But this novel could have given us so much more and expanded itself a little bit more, or like timing wise, I think it could have been done differently. So like I said, Eleni ended up giving this one 3 stars. The next book that I ended up reading was Dead Until Dark. This is the first book in the Sookie Stackhouse series by Charlotte Harris. I ended up reading this one because Bree from The Lock Petition and Deidre from Shade Tree Reads are doing a reread of the entire series, and I thought I would hop in and do this with them because I own a lot of the books. So this is basically a setup for the entire series where we are introduced to Sookie as a character, and it's clear in this world that vampires are now part of the general population. They still are looked at as oddities by some people. Some people like really worship the ground that they walk on, and like so many people, Sookie lives in this small isolated town in Louisiana, and she's hoping that she'll have her opportunity to see her vampire, and here comes Bill. Like, it just The discussion, and I'm gonna link the live show up in the card symbol above, because the discussion that we had about this book was really, really funny. Bill and Sookie their relationship is very insta love, and I was not really invested in the relationship. I could care less about the relationship. Bill is very dry. He's boring. I don't know what Sookie sees in that. He just is very vanilla, and I'm not saying that because he's white. He's very plain, and not saying that we should have plain characters, but in the context of this with vampires and the sexiness that we could do with this, like, Bill is just boring. He's very, very boring. And Sookie falls in love with him so quickly, and I'm just like, how? Y'all barely like communicate. Yeah, you haven't really gotten to know him. So why are you falling in love? It was strange. But I think that the reason why I ended up giving this 3 stars is that the world building and the kind of subplot of these murders that are happening, where these women are being killed in grotesque ways. So there's a serial killer clearly on the loose, and also this whole entire concept of a world existing where we have all these paranormal beings and creatures. It was really interesting, and I had read this book before, and I forgot that there were other instances of paranormal creatures that existed, and we see it primarily in another main character, but I'm not going to say what because I don't want to spoil it. But I'm super excited to see how this world is going to expand, because she did some interesting things with a specific paranormal creature and kind of flipped it on its head and turned it into something of her own, which I really did appreciate and really did enjoy. I think that I'm going to steer away from listening to these on audiobook, because I listened to this one on audiobook and it was horrible. The accents were horrible. So I'm going to pick up the second book physically and we'll go from there. But like I said, 3 stars. I'll be sure that I link that live show up top. It was great. I can't wait for the live show that's going to happen this month. The next book that I ended up reading was another middle grade book, and it is a middle grade fantasy book, and it is Girl, Giant, and the Monkey King, and this is by Van Wong. And this book particularly focuses on a young Vietnamese American girl by the name of Tom, and Tom is at this school, and Tom does not fit in. Okay, Tom doesn't fit in, not only because, you know, middle school is rough, and she's also the new kid on the block, but she has this superhuman strength. She has no idea where it came from, and she plays soccer, and she's trying to figure out how to play soccer without injuring anybody or ruining the entire game, because she can't kick a ball without it like really doing damage to equipment or people, which I thought was a really, really interesting element. So this story is definitely it's not a retelling, but it includes elements of Sun Wukong, which is the Monkey King. So I know a little bit about the legend of the Monkey King. I did not know that it was prominent and told to Vietnamese children as well. So that was something that I learned that was new. I have read a couple of things about the Monkey King, and what Wong does really, really well with this story is that she doesn't rehash the entire legend of the Monkey King. She includes enough elements to give readers kind of like a backstory of him as a character, but basically he comes into the picture after Tom accidentally releases him through, I think, his pen. She doesn't do it on purpose, but somehow she gets a pen and it ends up releasing him, and she cuts a deal with him basically saying like, I'll help you get your magical staff back if you promise that you will help me get rid of my super strength. And it is a worldwide adventure. You meet other mythical beings and creatures, and it's really, really fascinating. The downside to this, y'all, the reason why I ended up giving it 3.5 stars, the pacing was not good on this at all, and it is over 300 pages. I think that middle grade fantasy books have to be very careful in terms of pacing when they're that long, because not every middle grade student is going to be up to reading big fantasy books like that, 1, and 2, if you are going to make your book that big, keeping a middle grade audience in mind, you have to make it fast paced. It's not like reading, you know, YA fantasy or adult fantasy where you can slow things down a bit and do, you know, world building and like extensive character development. Not saying that middle grade books don't have these things, but how you do it is very particular. And in this case, this book slowed too much. There were parts of the book that really, really dragged, and it was super unfortunate because it was a book that I would enjoy when the pace was extremely fast, and then I'd be like, I'm about to drop this book and put it down when it got really, really slow. And so it makes the read feel really long and taxing because this is constant like up and down. But I love what the story was doing, and I love the big reveals that we were getting towards the end, and it made me excited to pick up the second book in the series. But man, like the pacing was just not good on this, and I was very surprised that the pacing was not that good. But like I said, I ended up giving it 3 3.5 stars. I do plan on picking up the second book. When I'm going to pick it up, I don't know, because I'm not in a rush to pick it up because I'm scared about the pacing, but I do want to end up finishing it because I think it is only going to be a duology, if I'm not mistaken. The next book that I ended up reading is probably going to be on my most disappointing books of 2022 already. And it's not that the book is going to be low, like it's not rated extremely low. It's a solid book, but it was disappointing. And that is As Good as Dead. And that's book number 3 in A Good Girl's Guide to Murder trilogy. And I was kind of forewarned going into this that I may not enjoy this book as much as I enjoyed the first two. I gave the first two 5 stars. So I was kind of prepared, but honestly, I wasn't prepared. So this book, and it's going to be hard for me to talk about this because of how this book is designed. This book literally picks up exactly where we leave off in book 2. Can't tell you anything that happened about book 2 because it'll be a spoiler. But something that happened at the end of book 2 puts Pip in a very traumatizing position. She's not a traumatizing position. She's dealing with a lot of trauma as a result of what she saw at the end of book 2. And you really do get to see tidbits of the personality that you saw in books 1 and 2. But then you see how much this trauma has kind of seeped its way into every crack and corner of her life, and it's really troubling her to have to function and deal with life in a normal way. She keeps flashing back almost like it's PTSD, and it's rough, y'all. This book is dark. I thought it was going to be dark because of the way book 2 ended, but my goodness, it's darker than what I anticipated. And I didn't rate it at 3.5 because of the fact that Pip is a different character in this. I think that she needed to be a different character because of what she saw at the end of book 2. If I experienced what she experienced at the end of book 2, I would be different as well. I would have to figure out how to handle and navigate a lot of the trauma that I had experienced. But here's the thing. So eventually we find out that Pip has a stalker. We don't know who it is, but they keep sending her these random emails and leaving dead birds outside of her house. So she connects the dots and figures out that it may be a kind of trademark of a serial killer. However, halfway through the book, we get the reveal of who it is. So I was confused, not because of the person that it was, because I was like, oh, okay, that makes sense. I get how it could possibly be this individual, and connecting all of the dots together and figuring this thing out. It wasn't that, but it was a decision that Pip makes during this whole situation where it was completely out of character. I don't know why Pip would have done what she did, and it threw me completely off to see her make that move because it was just so unlike her. It was completely out of character for her, and it dictates the tone of the second half of the book, which, if you think the first half of the book is dark, the second half of the book is just grim dark. Like, it's no hope. It's so hopeless. And I'm not saying that the book doesn't end on on an even playing field. Like, it's not like good, but it's not bad. But it was just so out of character for Pip to do that. Like, I could not get past that. And I think a lot of reviewers are conflicted because that in any other situation, like, Pip would have never done these things. So it just didn't add up, and it makes you feel some type of way about her as a character, believe it or not. But I think I still ended up giving it 3.5 stars because there's still an ingenious aspect of this entire plotting that Jackson ends up doing. She literally has created 3 books that are so interconnected that it's ridiculous. Like, if you go back and you read all of these stories, you realize that none of it really was as important as this final moment and this final discovery. It all pointed to this final discovery, and literally every single thing pointed to this moment. And I think that is the marking of a very, very good thriller series or mystery series. But unfortunately, that character shift, that character change, I was like, oh, I can't give it a 5-star because Pip wouldn't have done that. I've spent these 2 books getting to know Pip as a character, and having her do something that, like, on that level. And if you read this book, you'll know when I say, like, on that level, that was like a shocker. I literally was sitting at my desk like, no, she didn't. I know she didn't do that. So yeah, 3.5 stars. I'm gonna have to put it like on my most disappointing books because I was expecting more. I can recognize the beauty of it, but also recognize that, like, I don't know if I would have made that move. So the next book that I ended up reading was Loveboat Reunion by Abigail Henwen, and this is the second book, and I'm guessing this may be the Loveboat duology. I don't know if we're going to get a third series. This book literally picks up where the first book leaves off, and it is told from the perspective of Sophie and Xavier, which made me super hesitant because of the fact that Sophie was not the best character in the first book at all. She did a horrible thing to our main character ever in the first book, and I couldn't get past it. I thought she was forgiven too easily, and I was very nervous about possibly getting a book from her perspective because I still had some lingering feelings about her. So like I said, this literally takes place right after the events of Loveboat Taipei, and we are seeing Xavier and Sophie as they are leaving Loveboat Taipei, and they are headed to their respective places. Sophie is going to Dartmouth, and Xavier thought he was going to be doing whatever he wanted to do, but his father decides to send him back to high school to get his diploma because he did not actually graduate. So one thing that I really did enjoy about this is that the character storylines were very, very intriguing. With Sophie, we see her struggle a little bit while she's at Dartmouth, and she is supposed to be in this AI class in order to work towards her degree and keep her scholarship, and she ends up missing the deadline for the class because of things that happened in Loveboat Taipei, and so she is kind of auditing the class in order to figure out how to get a seat in, and she struggles a lot with the idea of having to develop some type of platform that explores AI, and she wants to combine her love for passion. She's really her love for fashion, not passion. So we end up really seeing Sophie get ridiculed and picked on because of the fact that she wants to combine her love for fashion and AI. And then on the other side, we see Xavier, who is diagnosed with dyslexia. We know this from the first book. He is going back to school, and he is really dealing with the ramifications of having an emotionally and physically abusive father. I think that is definitely a huge content warning. We know that his father is not that great in Loveboat Taipei, but in Loveboat Reunion, we definitely see some stuff on page that I was not anticipating, and his father is just not the greatest person in the world. So he's battling dyslexia and we're trying to work with his dyslexia, and he's going to this new high school with these accommodations, and he's really trying to figure out how he wants to live his life and not have to deal with his family. But so something ends up happening where Sophie and Xavier end up having to go back to Taipei in order to handle some stuff, and they end up having this Loveboat reunion. And I think that things get really, really interesting when we are back at, well, we're not at Loveboat, but the crew is kind of reconnected and reunited, but everything is still told from Sophie and Xavier's perspective. I think that the author did an excellent job in kind of building this romantic relationship between them, because they had such a rough time in the first book. They fell out heavy, but we see them build their relationship first concretely, like as a friendship, and then it extends into something that's a little bit more romantic. We see more of Xavier's family involved in this book, and we see the author really challenge stereotypical gender roles, not only in the tech industry, but in traditional Taiwanese families, about who can or cannot lead businesses. And I really like that those things were addressed, but also in some ways in a very subtle way. It wasn't like over the head, like I'm beating you with this information. It was done very nicely, and I really did appreciate that coming from the author. A couple of things that I do wish were included in this is that, of course, we know that Sophie had this huge thing that happened in the first book, and we are kind of seeing her address it in this book, but not extensively. It's really never talked about on page what she did. We just know that it was this big bad thing that she did, and that Ever is a saint for even forgiving her, and that she was coming from a very difficult place. And I think it's interesting seeing it now in Sophie's head, because you kind of get to see what her issues are and what she's struggling with and her family dynamics, because everything before was from Ever's perspective. But I wish that she would have taken a little bit more time to delve into it, because that was like a huge point of issue for a lot of people with that first book. Sophie's character was called into question quite a bit in that first book, so this book being written from her perspective, it's like, we wanted to get just a little bit more. And I also wish that we got a little bit more of Sophie and Xavier's relationship on page. So we get a lot of their interactions clearly, because the book is about the two of them and their experiences, and when they finally get together, it's definitely more so towards the end of the book, and we don't really get a lot of them on page, and I wish that we would have just gotten a little bit more of that. I was extremely hesitant, like I said, going into this, but it ended up being a solid read. I think this one does read a lot more mature than Loveboat Taipei. Loveboat Taipei felt very high school, as it should have, because they were high schoolers. This feels very like new adult going into college, and it should have gone that way because our characters are aging up, and it felt like the text was aged up, which I really did appreciate. Like I said, I don't know if there's going to be a third book in the series. I don't feel like I've gotten any indication that there is going to be a third book in the series. I'm feeling like this is just going to end up being a duology. So that is it, and I'm glad that we got to step back into this world again. Like I said, I ended up giving that one 4 stars. The next book that I ended up reading was probably one of the worst reading experiences that I've ever had. I mean, there are a couple books that have really tested me, but this one was a Black romance book that I was looking forward to. It is Let's Chill, which is the 3rd book in the 90s Kind of Love series, which I've been reading. This book is 27 pages long, and it took me a week to read it. That should have been like issue number 1. And I am very light-handed on criticism when it comes to editing and like proofreading and stuff like that in our indie romances, because they don't generally have the financial backing that traditional published romance writers have in terms of having like an editor. A lot of times it's only their eyes that's reading over it, or maybe they have someone that's close, or maybe if they're writing on a team, you know, they all take a look at the work before they push it out. However, this one was so glaringly wrong in terms of grammar that it was hard for me to read it. And I didn't even really care at that point what the story was about, because I could barely make it through paragraphs without trying to navigate who was talking, what the author was attempting to say, because grammatically it was just so bad. There were quotations that weren't used correctly, meaning that there would be a character speaking and the quotations weren't placed in the right way, or somebody would be speaking, there would be no quotations placed at all. There were words that were like misspelled. There were sentence structures that made absolutely no sense. And I usually, like I said, I don't go that hard on indie books when it comes to stuff like this, but this was so glaringly bad that I just couldn't look past it. So the story itself is about a hero and a heroine who had been married at one point, and she ends up leaving him at the altar. Fast forward, she's on a dating reality show where she has to marry someone that she's never seen before, and they, I think, have to, it's a competition. So the guy that she ends up marrying is her ex, and they are supposed to be working out whatever issues they had when she left him at the altar, which I really didn't even know what issues they had, because the story was so difficult to read. I just couldn't get anything out of it. I didn't even remember or care about the story at its core, because the book was so awful, y'all. I'm getting flustered even talking about it. There was a sex scene in the beginning of the book where they randomly have sex in a limo, and I'm like, but why? Where did this come from? Like, why is this happening right now? Like, I'm not saying that it always has to make sense, but literally in the context of the story, it literally was weird. It was strange, and it was almost like this was a rushed book because something had to be put out, because it was time for these books to be posted to KU, and unfortunately this author did not finish, or maybe didn't give themselves enough time to proofread the work, because I just can't believe that something with this many glaring grammatical errors was actually, you know, given out for people to read. Like, I literally just started highlighting through, and like, this is grammatically incorrect, like, and it's not like miniature things where it's like, oh, you forgot a set of quotation marks here. Like, it affected my process of reading the story. So I gave this 2 stars because I thought that the premise was a cute idea, but the execution was horrible, and there was no editing that was done whatsoever. So it made me not even want to finish the series, which is bad. It's really bad that it made me not want to finish the series. So I'll see what happens. And the last book that I ended up finishing before I delve really quickly into the graphic novels, comics, and manga that I ended up reading this month was Addicted After All, which is the 5th book in the Addicted series by Krista and Becca Ritchie. This was a reread for me. I ended up giving it 4 stars. It literally is a conclusion to Lily and Lo's story. If you know anything about the Addicted series, it is about these 2 characters, Lily and Lo. Lily is a sex addict, Lo is an alcoholic, and they have a romance that's been budding for years. They've been friends since they were kids, and they become dependent upon each other at some point where she's allowed to indulge in how much sex she wants all the time with her compulsions, and he's able to drink, and they start off fake dating, and then it goes from there. And it is a very unhealthy relationship, and it is acknowledged that the relationship is unhealthy and is very codependent, and they each have to go through therapy, rehab, whatever the case may be. This book explores some things that I don't want to spoil because I just don't want to tell you, but it was nice seeing Lily and Lo get their good conclusion. And I like that the authors did acknowledge that they are addicts and will forever be addicts. I think for Lily, that was a huge thing for her, because I think part of her wanted to be cured and wanted to no longer be an addict, and she came to that realization. So she was like, Lo, we're always going to be addicts. And he was like, there is no cure for what we're going through. It's just kind of a daily fight that we have to, you know, go through. Like, I'm always going to have the urge to drink. You're always going to have your sexual compulsions. And the only thing we can do is take it day by day and, you know, fight those challenges as much as we can. So I really, really appreciated this. I will be switching over probably this month to finish up the Calloway Sister series, and then I will be done. I don't know if I'm going to read the spinoff series, which is about the kids of the main characters of these books, but we'll see, because I haven't heard such great things about the characters in those books, and I don't know if I want to waste my time, because it's like 13 or 14 books, and I may not even have the time or the patience to do something of that level. Okay, so circling back around to the comics and graphic novels and manga that I ended up reading this month, which was a lot, of course. I mean, I read more, I think, in the first half of the month than I did in the second half of this month, but the first thing that I ended up reading in the second half of this month is Naruto, volume number 1. I have already read this volume before. This was a reread for me. I am trying to slowly make my way through the entire Naruto series. I'm not attempting to do that this year. I just want to start the process this year. So I kind of felt the same way that I felt about the series the first time I read it. It is about a kid by the name of Naruto. He's going through, I believe, it's ninja school, and I don't know the exact name of the school, but it is a ninja school, and he's just a troublemaker. He doesn't fit in. Nobody can stand him, and he is supposed to be graduating from ninja school, but he's just not doing what he's supposed to be doing. He's not, you know, passing the benchmarks that he should be passing, and then we get this big reveal about who Naruto really is and what it means for their town. And I thought that the story itself was interesting. Of course, there are some issues with depiction of women in this, mainly with the main character Sakura. I think that she was often like depicted as lovesick, boy crazy, and dumb, and I didn't really like that. But this was produced in 1999, so I'm not really surprised by that, but I did enjoy my reread enough to want to continue the series. And I gave it 4 stars if I didn't say that already. The next one that I ended up reading was the Sand Warrior, which is the first book, I believe, in the five World series. It's book number 1 in the 5 World series. And I actually ended up reading this one because I got the recommendation on Twitter, and I can't for the life of me remember who gave me this recommendation. Somebody gave me this recommendation, and I can't remember who did it. If one of you remember that it was you, please let me know. Somebody gave me this recommendation. It's also a series that's really, really popular at the library. A lot of kids like Sand Warrior books, can't keep them on the shelf worth of anything. So we have digital copies, so I thought, okay, this will be fun for me to go ahead and check out the series. And it literally is about these 5 worlds that are on the verge of extinction unless someone is able to light these beacons, particularly a Sand Warrior, and no one has been able to do it. And we focus on a main character by the name of Una, who is supposedly like really, really clumsy, not really gifted, not as gifted as her sister, who was supposed to be the iconic Sand Warrior who was going to light the beacons, but she disappears. And then we find out that maybe Una is not as clumsy as we may think she is, and she partners with 2 other characters in the story who are kind of off to save the world, supposedly, because there's a twist at the end of this where I think that maybe that theory of saving the world is not exactly what we think it is. I think that this was really, really interesting in terms of like art style and color palette choosing. It was really, really beautiful. I was really, really drawn into the art, but the story itself was a little bit hard to get into in the beginning, and I know that I'm not the biggest fantasy reader, but it was kind of convoluted at times, and it was hard to decipher exactly what was going on, and then there were bits of it that were like really, really dry. But I think that it does get better in future volumes, but I did end up giving this one 3.5 out of 5 stars. The next things that I read in terms of comics, graphics, and comics, graphic novels, and manga was saying that too fast. Saga volume 9 and issue number 55. Not going to talk about these because we had a complete live show about, you know, volume 9 and 55. It was so great. I am so appreciative to my co-host for really diving into these comics with me and rereading the entire series. with issue 55 dropping on the 26th of January. So I'll make sure I leave that live show in the card symbol above. Volume 9 was a 5-star read for me. Issue 55 was a 4-star read for me, and there's so much feelings. I cried with Volume 9. That's all I'm gonna say. I cried. I did cry. The next manga that I ended up reading was Sweat and Soap Volume 2. This is one that I can't really talk much about because it's the second in the series. I did end up giving it 4 out of 5 stars. It was great seeing the relationship develop between our two characters. If you didn't know, it is a kind of romance, slice of life type of manga where we have these two characters. One, our heroine definitely has a, like, she sweats a lot. I would say she perspires a lot. No, she sweats a lot. She sweats a lot. And she's worried about how that'll make her smell. And our hero is actually the soap or scent developer at this soap company. And he loves the way that she smells. And their first encounter, he sniffs her. And he goes off from there, and they develop a friendship and then a relationship, and it's really cute, y'all. I'm really enjoying it, and I'm thinking that essentially what's going to end up happening is that we're going to just see the relationship continue to progress. I think the last volume in the series has already come out, so this is the perfect time to go ahead and binge, so you're not waiting for any more volumes to get translated and released here in the United States. The next thing that I have is the Complete Persepolis by Marjane Satrapi. This is one that we read for the Realm of Comics Book Club for the month of January. I had a live show discussion with Bree, so I'm not going to talk about this one. Of course, it was a 5-star read for me. This was like my 4th time reading it. Absolutely loved it, but if you want to hear more of our thoughts, I will link that live show in the card symbol above. And the last thing that I read, the last thing that we're talking about, is For the Kid I Saw in My Dreams, volume number 1. This is one that I randomly ended up picking up. I don't even remember where I got this recommendation from. Maybe I saw it on the library website. I could have seen it on like Goodreads. I don't know, but my library did have it, so I decided to request it to read it. And it is about a young boy who ends up really seeing like his entire family get murdered, and he has a special connection with his brother, his twin brother, and he doesn't really care about the fact that his mom and his dad get murdered. His dad is abusive, and he had some resentment towards his mother because he felt like she just kind of stood on the sidelines and took the abuse and didn't really actively try to stop it from happening. But when he realizes that this connection is severed with his twin brother, he makes it his life goal to go after the killer. So this is like a mystery thriller event or mystery thriller type of story, and I really did end up enjoying that element. This is definitely like the start of the story. It's not a lot of development. I think that this may end up having a lot of twists and turns. This is the same mangaka of the manga Erase, which I've gotten a lot of recommendations to read, so I definitely will be checking that out. I like the art style except for the lips of the girls. Like, it just really bothered me that they were made like to be super big. It just didn't work. I just didn't like it. I just didn't like the lip style. It's a personal thing. I just didn't like the lip style of the women that he was drawing. It was awful. So anyway, one of the things that is really interesting about this is that we do get to a point where we think that he's gotten his clues to catch who the killer is, but then it's a completely different twist. It's like a different element that gets thrown in, and it ends kind of on a cliffhanger. So I did request the second volume, and I think it's waiting on me at the library, so I definitely will be reading it in the month of February. I ended up giving this one, I believe, 3 stars, or maybe it was 3.5. It was 3 stars. It's a 3-star read for me, which is not bad. Okay, so that is it, y'all. That is my February wrap up. I'm actually doing this and posting this on time. I'm so very shocked. I'm very, very surprised and shocked because I usually don't do this type of stuff on time, but I'm doing it on time this time, and I'm very excited. I hope you all like this video. Let me know let me know your favorite book that you read this month and the worst book that you read this month. I'm very excited to see. As always, if you like this video, give it a thumbs up. If you want to see more content from me, click the subscribe button, hit the bell for notifications. And if you're looking for ways to support the channel, follow me on social media. All those links will be down in the description box below, and I'll be back with another video soon.